The following entries are reproduced from the personal journal of Jason Lathrop. This copy was prepared and lightly edited for readability by the April Holden Private Historical Library, and is published here with their special permission. Friday, January 7, 1910. At 9 this morning, I spoke with Dr. Simons in his rooms on Marlborough Street. He maintains that I am not ill, only unsettled by father's passing. He spoke again of nervous strain, and urges that I keep a daily account of my thoughts, in order to impose some order upon them. I agreed to try it. I am not persuaded of its usefulness, though he seems confident enough for us both. Reached the banking house shortly after 11. The year's accounts continue to demand attention. Harrington mislaid a bundle of correspondence, which occasioned some confusion before luncheon, though nothing of consequence came of it. I answered an inquiry from Mrs. Cabot regarding the Western bonds father had overseen. It required less consultation than I had expected. That is something. The evening turned sharply cold. I walked once around the square after supper. Snow remains along the curbs, darkened with soot, and frost lay upon the iron fences. Several houses were shuttered by 8:30. The lamps cast long shadows across the cobbles. I shall attempt retiring earlier tonight. Dr. Simons insists that regular habits are half the cure. We shall see. Saturday, January 8, 1910. Slept soundly and did not wake before the alarm, which is unusual of late. I cannot determine whether to credit the doctor or mere fatigue, but I rose in tolerable spirits. The morning was bright enough, though the snow along the square grows steadily more begrimed. One of the front steps opposite has gone unswept and looks neglected. At the office shortly after 9. Saturdays bring fewer callers, though there is always something from the week requiring attention. I reviewed several statements intended for posting and, in doing so, misread a figure in the December column. The copy was nearly dispatched before Harrington noticed the discrepancy. The error was not large, but it would have reflected poorly had it gone forward. I corrected it and had the page redone. An unnecessary waste of time. I must look twice at such things. A small disagreement with Mr. Pritchard regarding the order of entry for certain notes. He prefers to proceed in batches. I do not. The discussion was brief and outwardly civil, though I think he finds my oversight irksome. He has been in the office longer than I have. Cannot be helped. The books must be kept as father kept them. In any case, the matter did not detain us long. I found myself oddly brisk with correspondence thereafter and cleared more from the desk than I had expected. A letter to Mr. Alden required redrafting, as I had struck too sharp a tone in the first attempt. That is, twice this week I have done so. Home before dark. Mother received a note from Aunt Lydia and insisted on reading portions aloud after tea, with myself, Clara, and Robert in attendance, pausing once or twice to smooth the folds with her usual care. Interestingly, Aunt Lydia did not include the customary account of her cat breaking a claw. I feel neither strained nor particularly elated this evening, but steady, which is preferable. If sleep continues so, the rest may follow. I shall retire presently. Sunday, January 9, 1910. A restless night. I woke several times without clear cause and lay awake longer than was necessary, listening to the wind along the chimney. Rose later than intended and not altogether restored by the attempt at sleep. There is a dullness that follows such nights which no amount of resolve seems at once to dispel. We attended service in the morning. The sky was remarkably clear, a sharp blue against the snow, and the air bracing enough to redden the ears before one reached the corner. The square looked almost cheerful in the sun, though the cold was unrelenting. The sermon was competently delivered, if somewhat protracted. I found it difficult to fix my attention as steadily as I ought. There are moments, particularly on Sundays, when one has too much leisure to consider matters, in which I am struck by a curious sense of standing somewhat apart, though I cannot say precisely from what. It is unreasonable and I suspect largely the product of fatigue, yet it presses in spite of that knowledge. One expects, after November, that certain assurances might present themselves more readily than they do. Spoke with Miss Shaw for several minutes after service. She recalled father with evident sincerity. The exchange was unremarkable in itself, yet it had the effect of settling me. We remarked upon the brightness of the day and the inconvenience of the frozen ruts along Beacon Street, and she laughed at some small absurdity of the weather. It was a pleasant moment. Returned home for dinner. The afternoon passed quietly. I do not feel particularly improved, but neither am I so out of spirits as in the morning. If the night proves more kind, tomorrow may begin on firmer ground. Monday, January 10th, 1910. Sleep was poor again. I awoke more than once before the alarm and lay turning the hours over in my mind, unable to rest. The morning light seemed harsh through the window, and I felt unready to begin the day. Even the simplest tasks required an effort. Walked to the office. The sun fought weakly against the frost, and the square was still white and gray from yesterday's snow. I met a man along the street, a very tall stranger, who made some small remark about the weather and my coat. I nodded and answered politely, but the exchange left me neither cheered nor troubled. It passed as quickly as it occurred, though my thoughts lingered elsewhere. At home Robert and I argued once more about his lessons and the back door. I tried to speak calmly, but he would not attend to what I said, and I grew sharper than I ought. The disagreement passed quickly enough, yet it left a shadow over the afternoon which nothing else quite dispelled. Mother observed silently from the doorway, frowning slightly but saying nothing, and Clara played her piano in the next room, though I scarcely noticed. I reviewed some correspondence and accounts in the study, but the work dragged and I made little progress. I glanced up from time to time at the lamplit cobbles outside, then returned to the page, only to find myself drawn again into thought. The wind rose later in the evening, rattling the shutters and making the house feel colder than it was. I shall retire soon. The hope of sleep feels remote tonight. Perhaps tomorrow will bring steadier spirits, though the week begins under no particular promise. Tuesday, January 11th, 1910. Slept soundly overnight and rose in unusually good spirits compared with the past several nights. The morning air was crisp and clear, and everything seemed to shine with an uncommon brightness, though the frost still lingered. I felt a measure of energy and readiness that I have not known for some days. At the office, the usual routine unfolded without incident. The ledgers were checked and correspondence reviewed with care. There was a small pang of dissatisfaction, a sense of standing somewhat unsupported in my duties, but it passed quickly, leaving only a faint awareness of it. Even so, it tempered the early cheerfulness only slightly. The day held more promise than most recent mornings. At home, another disagreement arose with Robert concerning the order in which his lessons should be managed. The discussion grew irritable for a few moments, and I found my temper more frayed than I had expected. The argument was brief, yet it brought my mood to neutral for a time. I attended to correspondence and some minor business matters later in the day in the study. The remainder of the afternoon passed quietly. My spirits recovered slowly, though they did not return to their initial morning brightness. Nevertheless, I find myself content enough as evening falls and the lamps cast long reflections along the square. I shall retire presently, hopeful that the night will maintain the ease of sleep I enjoyed last night. Wednesday, January 12th, 1910. Slept well overnight and awoke again feeling refreshed. The morning was bright, and the square seemed to gleam in the sunlight that touched the frost along the railings. My spirits were high from the outset, and I found myself anticipating the day with uncommon cheer. At the office, the morning passed easily. Shortly after noon, I encountered Richard Wentworth on Beacon Street. We spoke of the Purcellian Club and discussed the possibility of some pigeon shooting in the spring. The conversation was easy and spirited. His familiar wit and good temper left me markedly buoyant, lifting my mood beyond even the pleasant beginning of the day. The remainder of the day was quiet and agreeable. Correspondence was attended to with little difficulty, and the ledgers required only routine oversight. Returning home, I found the household calm. Clara practiced briefly at the piano, and Robert was diligent in his reading. Mother remarked upon the brightness of the day and the warmth of the sun in the front rooms, and I found her observation reassuring. I retire this evening with a sense of contentment rare of late. Sleep seems promised again, and with it, I hope, the steadying of spirits that has so often proved uncertain. Thursday, January 13th, 1910. The night afforded little rest. I woke more than once and rose this morning with a heaviness that did not readily lift. Snow had begun falling before breakfast and continued steadily through the day, a gray blanket that quieted the square more than usual. From the front windows the railings were half buried, and the lamps along the walk stood blurred behind the drifting flakes. I went to the office as usual, though the weather seemed to discourage callers and little of consequence required attention. The hours passed slowly, and I found it difficult to fix my thoughts upon even the smallest matters. Returned home in the afternoon. The house was still for most of the evening, save for the faint sound of Clara moving about upstairs. I shall retire early and hope for sounder sleep tonight. Friday, January 14th, 1910. Slept deeply and rose this morning with a clear head and uncommon energy. The sky was still overcast, though the air held none of yesterday's snow, and the square lay quiet under a dull winter light. At the office I attended to the usual accounts and correspondence without difficulty. Nothing of consequence required decision, though the steady progress of routine matters was agreeable enough. A note arrived by post in the afternoon, an invitation to a dinner party at the Whitcomb residence on the 27th. I have not had occasion to see Mrs. Whitcomb for several years. She has been much in society of late, though I know her only slightly, and the invitation was somewhat unexpected. Nearly lost my footing along the pavement returning home this evening, where a thin sheet of ice had formed unnoticed near the corner. I recovered myself without much ceremony, though it served as a reminder to walk more carefully in such weather. I remain in good spirits tonight and shall retire presently. Saturday, January 15th, 1910. No entry exists for this date. Sunday, January 16th, 1910. Slept soundly enough through the night, though the morning found me in a poorer frame of mind than seemed warranted by the rest I had taken. The sky remained overcast through much of the day. The houses appeared dull beneath the gray light, and the air carried that still, muted quality which often accompanies such weather in winter. The morning passed quietly at home. Mother occupied herself with some household letters, and Clara practiced for a time upstairs, though even the piano seemed subdued today. I found it difficult to settle upon any one train of thought and drifted between small tasks without much conviction. Toward the afternoon, I attended to a piece of office correspondence that had remained unanswered since the close of the week. It concerned a minor inquiry regarding certain Western Railway bonds father had previously overseen. The matter proved simpler than I had anticipated, and I was able to set the reply down with a clarity that had been absent earlier in the day. Finishing it brought an unexpected sense of relief, small though the accomplishment was. It is curious how even a modest piece of order can steady the mind when it has begun the day in disorder. The weather cleared toward evening rather suddenly. The clouds broke apart just before sunset, and the western sky shone with a rosy brightness. For several minutes the windows opposite caught the light and glowed warmly against the cold air. It was a brief spectacle, but a welcome one. I do not feel entirely restored tonight, yet the day closes in a somewhat steadier fashion than it began. That is perhaps sufficient for the present. I shall retire shortly and hope tomorrow begins with less heaviness. Monday, January 17th, 1910. Slept soundly through the night, though the rest did not quite restore me as fully as I had hoped. Still, the morning began with a steadier temper than several of the past days have afforded. The sky held scattered clouds with intervals of pale winter sun, and the square appeared brighter than yesterday. The frost along the railings glittered faintly where the light touched it, and there was a sense, if not of warmth, then at least of some slight easing in the severity of the season. I walked to the office as usual. The air carried that peculiar clarity which often follows several days of dull weather, and the cobbles rang sharply beneath the wheels of the few passing carriages. Nothing of particular note occurred during the morning. The correspondence was moderate, and the ledgers required only their usual attention. It was the sort of day in which work proceeds without interruption or distinction, yet leaves one quietly satisfied at its close. I noticed, while reviewing several small accounts late in the morning, that my thoughts remained more orderly than they have been of late. There was none of the wandering impatience that troubled me last week. Even the minor inconveniences that arise in any office, misfiled papers, small questions from the clerks, seemed easily borne. It is a relief to find the mind capable again of steady application, however modest the task. Returned home shortly before dusk. The sun was already sinking behind the roofs along the square, leaving the upper windows touched with a dim golden light while the street itself lay in shadow. The lamplighter had begun tending the lamps along the walk. Clara practiced briefly at the piano, and Robert occupied himself with his lessons, muttering softly over a difficult passage before settling again. The familiar sound carried pleasantly through the house, lending a quiet rhythm to the evening. Mother spent part of the evening with her correspondence. There are days which pass without incident and yet leave behind a sense of quiet order. Today was such a day. I cannot say that my spirits are unusually high, nor that the concerns of recent weeks have entirely lifted, but the mind feels more disposed toward its ordinary habits. Perhaps this is the sort of gradual settling Dr. Simons had in mind when he recommended this exercise. I shall retire presently and hope the night brings rest enough to continue the week in the same spirit. Tuesday, January 18th, 1910. Sleep came fitfully last night, and I rose with a dullness that was far from the cheerfulness I had hoped to carry into the day. The morning at the office passed without incident. I attended to the ledgers and correspondence, though nothing required more than routine attention, and the work was completed as expected. At home, a disagreement arose between Mother and the cook over the use of garlic in the dinner. I intervened in an effort to restore some order, though the exchange left the household atmosphere somewhat tense for a time. Later, Clara and Robert and I attended to a small stray cat that has taken to lingering near the front steps on occasion. The creature accepted our attention with apparent contentment, a small but welcome diversion from the earlier disturbance. I retire this evening with my mood tempered yet steady, and hope for more restful sleep tonight. Wednesday, January 19th, through Thursday, January 20th, 1910. No entries exist for these dates. Friday, January 21st, 1910. Slept deeply and rose with a clear head, though my spirits did not quite follow the improvement in rest. The household was occupied early with several small matters of routine. Mother had some question regarding the ordering of provisions, which detained us briefly before I left for the office. While passing along Beacon Street later in the day, I encountered Miss Shaw, bound for Charles Street. We spoke only a few minutes, chiefly of her Christmas trip to Vermont. Her manner was cheerful, and the conversation, brief though it was, lifted my spirits somewhat. Toward evening, while returning home, I came upon a small disturbance along the street. A man who had slipped upon the pavement. Several passers-by assisted him, though he appeared shaken for some moments. The incident lingered unpleasantly with me as I continued on. The cold grew more severe after dark. I feel tonight much as I did this morning, somewhat subdued, though not altogether out of spirits, and hope the night's rest will carry me into tomorrow with steadier thoughts. Saturday, January 22nd, 1910. Slept deeply and rose this morning in steady spirits. The walk to the office was slower than usual, though nothing of consequence occurred. Little else distinguished the day. I returned home before dark. The evening promises to be quiet, and I shall retire early. Sunday, January 23rd, 1910. The night afforded another very satisfactory rest. I woke shortly before the alarm with the agreeable sense of having slept thoroughly, the mind clear and the body free of heaviness. The sky beyond the window was pale and somewhat indistinct, and during breakfast a light snow began falling at intervals, sometimes thick enough to obscure the opposite houses for a few moments, then thinning again into a fine drifting powder. A distinctive smell of steam drifted up from the kitchen. The square possessed a quiet aspect under the shifting flurries. The iron railings and steps, so recently cleared, had taken on once more a thin white covering, and the walk along the garden lay marked only by the occasional passing footprints of an early pedestrian. The air held that soft stillness peculiar to days when snow comes and goes without committing itself fully to a storm. I remained at home through the morning, reading for a time in the front room while Mother attended to several household letters. Clara moved about upstairs at intervals, and though she did not practice long today, the faint notes of the piano drifted down once or twice through the stairwell. Robert occupied himself with a book near the window and seemed content enough in his own pursuits. The house felt orderly and calm. During the afternoon I attended briefly to a small matter of health that had been recommended some weeks ago. Nothing serious in itself, merely a minor precaution that Dr. Simons had thought worth seeing to. The affair proved far simpler and more comfortable than I had expected. Indeed, it was concluded so easily that I wondered afterward why I had allowed it to occupy my thoughts at all beforehand. There is a curious relief in discovering that something anticipated with mild apprehension proves, in fact, entirely manageable. Though the matter was slight, it was nevertheless agreeable to have it settled and behind me. The snow continued its intermittent pattern throughout the afternoon. At times the square appeared nearly clear, only for another passing veil of white to drift down a quarter-hour later. Toward dusk the lamps along the walk shone faintly through the moving flakes, lending the street a subdued and almost tranquil appearance. I cannot say that the day has stirred my spirits in any particular direction. They remain much as they were this morning, steady and undisturbed. Yet the sense of physical ease following a sound night's rest is no small comfort, and the quiet regularity of the household has suited me well enough. If sleep returns tonight in the same fashion, the week may begin under favorable conditions. I shall retire shortly. Monday, January 24th, 1910. The night afforded a sound enough rest, though not so deep as some of the better nights lately. Still, I woke at the proper hour with a tolerably clear head. Snow had begun again some time before dawn, and by the time I came downstairs it was falling thickly, the flakes large and slow, gathering steadily. From the front windows, the scene had taken on that muffled, subdued character which accompanies a heavy snowfall. The iron railings were already thickly coated, and the paths through the garden showed only the faint beginnings of a track where some early passerby had made his way across. The opposite houses appeared softened by the falling snow, their outlines less distinct against the gray sky. Even the usual sounds of the street, carriage wheels upon the stones, the occasional call of a driver, seemed diminished. The walk to the office proved slower than usual. The snow had begun to accumulate in earnest, and the pavements were uneven underfoot where earlier layers had hardened beneath the fresh fall. Carriages moved cautiously along the street, their progress deliberate, the wheels cutting dark tracks through the whitened roadway. The cold was sharp on the face and ears, though the steady movement made it tolerable. The morning at the office passed in its ordinary course. The weather appeared to discourage callers, and the correspondence was lighter than on most Mondays. I examined the ledgers and a handful of routine matters left from the close of last week. Nothing required particular judgment or exertion, yet the quiet progress of such tasks is not without its own satisfaction. There is a certain steadiness in work that proceeds without interruption, each figure and page following the next in an orderly fashion. At intervals I found my attention wandering briefly to the windows, where the snow continued its slow descent. The street below looked nearly deserted through much of the afternoon, save for the occasional figure passing with head bent against the wind. By the time I left the office, the accumulation had grown considerable, and the air held that dry, biting cold which often follows a long snowfall. Returning home, the square lay hushed beneath the storm. The lamps had begun to glow through the drifting flakes, their light diffused in the whitened air so that each seemed surrounded by a faint halo. Footsteps were few, and the houses stood quiet behind their darkened windows. The evening passed calmly within doors. Clara touched the piano for a short while after supper in an attempt at Chopin, the sound carrying softly through the rooms, and Robert occupied himself with his reading near the lamp. Mother remarked upon the severity of the weather and wondered whether the snow might continue into tomorrow. I cannot say the day has altered my spirits in any remarkable fashion, yet there has been a mild ease about it from beginning to end. After several unsettled weeks, such ordinary days possess a certain quiet value of their own. I shall retire presently and hope the night proves as sound as the last. Tuesday, January 25, 1910. Slept soundly enough last night and woke at the usual hour with a clear head, though the rest itself was unremarkable. The snow of yesterday had ceased entirely, and the morning opened under a sky of uncommon clarity. From the window the square appeared freshly renewed by the storm, the railings and steps sharply defined and the air bright with that pale winter light which follows a clear night after heavy snow. The cold was keen when I stepped outside, yet the brightness of the morning lent the walk an agreeable quality. The pavements had been partially cleared along the principal paths, though in many places the snow remained piled in ridges along the curbs where the shovels had cast it aside. Carriages passed more frequently than yesterday, their wheels crunching audibly over the packed surface of the street, and several pedestrians moved briskly along the walks with that air of renewed activity which often follows a storm's conclusion. For reasons I cannot readily account for, I found myself in unusually good spirits from the outset of the day. There was a lightness of mind and readiness for work that has been absent more often than present earlier in the month. Perhaps the brightness of the morning had something to do with it, or perhaps the steady nights of sleep recently have begun to exert their intended effect. In any case, the day seemed to begin under a favorable influence. At the office, the routine duties of the morning proceeded without interruption. The correspondence was moderate, and the ledgers required only their ordinary attention. Nothing arose that demanded particular effort, yet I found the work agreeable in a way that surprised me somewhat. Figures that might on another day have seemed tedious appeared instead merely ordered, each account falling into place with little resistance. The light from the windows remained strong throughout the afternoon, reflecting brightly from the snow in the street below. Several times I noticed the sun catching upon the upper panes of the opposite buildings, so that they flashed momentarily against the otherwise subdued winter colors. It lent the whole district a livelier aspect than it has possessed for some days. I returned home while there was still a trace of daylight along the western roofs. The square retained much of its brightness, though the cold had begun to sharpen again as evening approached. Within the house the atmosphere was quiet and familiar. Clara spent some time at the piano after supper, and Robert stooped over his lessons with an attentiveness that spared me any need for interference. Mother remarked upon the improvement in the weather and expressed the hope that the roads beyond the city might soon become passable again. There has been nothing today to distinguish it in any particular way, and yet I feel a certain quiet satisfaction in its passage. The mind has moved easily from one task to the next, untroubled by the wandering thoughts that have lately intruded upon my work. It is a small thing, perhaps, but not an unwelcome one. If tomorrow begins in a similar fashion, I shall count it fortunate indeed. I retire tonight in steady and cheerful spirits. Wednesday, January 26, 1910. I slept remarkably well last night. The morning brought a clear and refreshed feeling that made everything seem immediately more manageable. The sky was partly clouded when I looked out upon the square, patches of pale blue appearing between long stretches of gray. The snow from earlier in the week remains in the garden and along the curbs, though the principal walks have been cleared and show the dark stones again where the traffic has worn them through. The air was brisk but not unpleasant during the walk to the office, and the city seemed to have resumed its ordinary movement after the recent storms. Several carriages passed along Beacon Street at a lively pace, the sound of hooves striking sharply upon the stone. At the banking house, a small matter arose regarding the heating of the offices. The coal furnace in the cellar has struggled somewhat to keep the front rooms evenly warm since the heavier weather began, and this morning the temperature in the main office was noticeably uneven. Harrington and I spent a short time with the building man reviewing the fire and the draft through the grates. Nothing appeared seriously amiss, only that the coal had been burning somewhat irregularly, and after a small adjustment the rooms began gradually to improve. The affair occupied little time and proved more a minor inconvenience than anything deserving of concern. The remainder of the day passed quietly enough. Correspondence was attended to without difficulty, and the ledgers required only their ordinary checking. I found the work agreeable, perhaps owing in part to the sound sleep of the night before, which seems to leave the mind better disposed toward steady effort. Returned home before dusk under a sky that had grown clearer toward evening. I feel tonight much as I did this morning, steady and capable of meeting small irritations without undue concern, which is a condition I am glad enough to preserve. I shall retire shortly and hope the night proves as restorative as the last. Thursday, January 27, 1910. The night proved a poor one. Sleep came reluctantly and did not remain long once it had arrived. I woke several times without clear cause and at last rose earlier than was necessary, feeling little restored by the attempt. My thoughts moved restlessly from one matter to another in the hours before dawn, returning more than once to the engagement of this evening at Mrs. Whitcomb's, though I cannot say precisely why it should have occupied my mind so persistently. The morning was cold and unsettled. A light flurry of snow moved intermittently across the square, driven at times by a sharp wind that swept along the street corners. The sky remained a dull gray through much of the day, and the air held that dry bitterness which seems to penetrate even a heavy coat. At the office I found it difficult to fix my attention upon the ledgers as steadily as I ought. Nothing of consequence demanded immediate decision, yet even the routine pages appeared to require more effort than usual. I was conscious of a certain dullness of mind and allowed several small matters to remain until tomorrow rather than risk overlooking some figure through inattention. I arrived at Mrs. Whitcomb's somewhat later than intended this evening, though not so late as to occasion remark. The house was already lively with conversation when I entered, and for a moment I feared the evening might prove rather fatiguing. Such gatherings sometimes possess an air of exertion that one senses immediately upon entering a room. Happily this impression did not endure. The company proved agreeable enough once dinner was underway, and the atmosphere soon settled into an easy rhythm. Mrs. Whitcomb received her guests with evident satisfaction and seemed in particularly high spirits. I was introduced for the first time to Miss Danica DeLorean, whom I had heard mentioned on previous occasions as something of a protégé of our hostess, though I had never met her until tonight. She proved quite unlike the image I had formed from second-hand descriptions. She is a striking young woman, remarkably tall, nearly my own height, with hair of so pale a blonde that in certain light it approaches silver. Her eyes are a clear blue of uncommon brightness. Mrs. Whitcomb appears to take considerable pride in her, which is understandable enough. By chance we were seated beside one another at table, and our conversation during the early courses was both easy and unexpectedly engaging. Miss Louisa Shaw was also present, and we exchanged a few words before dinner, though the opportunity was brief. Later in the evening Mr. Loring drew me into a rather extended discussion among several of the gentlemen concerning the present economic and political condition of Europe. He has lately returned from a lengthy stay abroad and spoke with great conviction on the matter. According to him, the various tensions upon the continent have reached a point at which some form of war may soon become unavoidable, though he did not pretend to know precisely where or how such a conflict might begin. His remarks were received with polite interest but also with a fair measure of skepticism by the others present. When at last I took my leave and stepped out into the cold air, the snow was again drifting lightly through the lamplight. As I walked home through the quiet streets, I found my spirits altered from those of the morning. There was a curious sensation of anticipation, something akin to the feeling one experiences when setting out upon a journey toward an unfamiliar place. I cannot say what prompted the impression, yet it lingered with me for much of the walk home. I retire tonight with the mind more awake than earlier in the day, though I hope sleep will come more readily than it did last night. Friday, January 28, 1910. The night just past afforded a most remarkable rest, deep and continuous, a return to the trend of the days before yesterday. I slept heavily and without interruption, waking shortly before the alarm with the clear and composed sensation that follows truly restorative sleep. It is a curious thing how greatly the mind's disposition depends upon such simple physical circumstances. Whatever unsettled thoughts occupied me yesterday evening seemed to have receded somewhat in the interval of the night. The morning opened under a low, overcast sky. The cold was sharp enough to bite at the face upon stepping outside, though the absence of wind made it more tolerable than the harsher days earlier in the week. The square lay quiet beneath the dim winter light. The snow along the railings and in the garden remains largely undisturbed. A thin crust had formed upon the surface during the night, and the sound of it breaking faintly beneath one's step lent the walk a dry, brittle character. I felt neither particularly cheerful nor oppressed by the day as it began, only steady, with the mind disposed toward its ordinary duties. After the unsettled sleep of the night before the dinner, such composure is not unwelcome. Indeed, there is a certain satisfaction in finding the thoughts arranged in their proper order again, each matter appearing in its place without wandering distraction. The morning passed quietly enough, though I attended briefly to a small matter of health which proved somewhat vexing in its execution. It was nothing of serious consequence, merely one of those minor inconveniences that require attention out of prudence rather than necessity. The affair itself was attended by a certain awkwardness and delay which might easily have tried one's patience on another day. As it was, I found the annoyance slight enough to disregard once the business had concluded. Such trifles often loom larger in anticipation than they deserve. Beyond this, little distinguished the hours. The cold persisted through the afternoon, and the sky remained stubbornly gray, casting the square in that subdued winter light which seems neither fully day nor properly evening. The lamps were lit earlier than usual, their pale glow appearing faintly against the sky before dusk had properly settled. Returning home, I noticed the air had grown stiller, and the faint smell of coal smoke hung about the street, drifting upward from the neighboring houses. Within doors the household was quiet and orderly. Clara passed the better part of an hour at the piano after supper, though she kept to softer passages this evening, the music carrying gently through the rooms. Robert applied himself to his lessons with little prompting, and Mother spent some time with her correspondence near the lamp. The day has not altered my spirits in any particular direction, yet I cannot deny the benefit of beginning it under the influence of such excellent rest. If the night should repeat the favor, I suspect the coming days may proceed with greater steadiness. I shall retire shortly, while the sense of that calm still lingers. Saturday, January 29, 1910. No entry exists for this date. Sunday, January 30, 1910. The night's sleep was unfortunately poor and broken. Curiously, it did little to dampen my spirits. The morning was cold but partly clear, with intervals of pale sunlight falling across the square and lending the snow a faint brightness. Later in the day I attended a small luncheon gathering on Mount Vernon Street, where I encountered Mrs. Whitcomb and Miss DeLorean once more. Our exchange was brief but very agreeable. Miss DeLorean proved attentive in conversation and displayed the same engaging manner I noticed the evening of the dinner. The meeting left me in excellent spirits, which had already begun the day unusually high. The air grows sharper tonight. I shall retire shortly. Monday, January 31st, 1910. I slept soundly through the night and woke at the proper hour. The rest was sufficient, and I rose with spirits carrying something of the unusual lightness that has accompanied the past day or two. The walk to the office was uneventful, and the business of the day proceeded without interruption. The correspondence was modest for a Monday, and the ledgers required only their usual examination. I applied myself with a steadiness that has been easier to maintain of late. Returning home, I found Robert and Clara attending to the stray cat which now so regularly makes an appearance. They were coaxing it to drink from a dish of milk. It obliged them after some hesitation and, having finished, darted off again toward some unknown crevice. I suspect Robert and Clara have set their hearts upon adopting it. The remainder of the evening passed in calm. My spirits remain uncommonly steady tonight. The day has passed without disturbance, and the household rests in its usual order. I shall retire presently.